So here's a really good article, I think, from the New European, and I think it sums up a lot of really attitude around Brexit and why this idea that we British have all this pluck and it doesn't matter, our grim and we'll grim and bear it and we'll get through it. In fact, if you listen to a lot of Brexiteers, when they particularly refer to like Remainers like me, they'll just be like, "Oh, shut up, we'll be fine." But where does this attitude actually come from? So, Brexiteers have deluded themselves with the belief in the native pluck of the British will eventually win the day. Our Brexit negotiators can't stop telling us that if we only keep on chanting no deal is better than a bad deal for long enough, the EU will eventually crack. Why will it crack? Because EU exporters above all the German car industry will perhaps at the last minute force the German government to acquire the EU to do Britain's bidding? Not everyone is so convinced. Analysts at the Bank of America and Merrill Lynch, for example, who report we are often confronted with the view that Germany's stance will have to soften because the UK market is too important for German exporters, car manufacturers in particular. We are sceptical, and they are also illogical. If Germany had to choose between protecting a market which absorbs 50% of its exports, i.e. the UK, EU-UK, and is thereby a 6.7 times bigger export market than the UK, it seems obvious where the long-term strategic economic preferences are. And as we keep on telling people, any market will obviously go for where the more customers are, and there are more customers in the single market than there are in just the UK. Oh dear. But it continues. But Liam Fox and co. simply know in their hearts that the EU is a wholly owned division of Germany, and that Germany, despite being so logically mighty, because it is so logically mighty, can always be outplayed by plucky Brits, because we Brits do not work on wretched German logic. If the Leave narrative has changed from there'll be no downside to Brexit to, okay, so we need the Dunkirk spirit, so much the better. Did we vote to leave out of any short-term economic calculation? No. We acted from a noble desire to reclaim our ancient sovereignty in a glorious trust that things will naturally somehow start to get better, say by 2030. The Germans, on the other hand, are being naturally calculating, rational, but funnily unimaginative, and will go for the short-term bottom line. No. This is what I've been saying. A lot of these Brexiteers are somehow convinced that this is what's going to happen, that all these countries are going to suddenly turn around and go, oh yeah, Britain is such an important market, we need it, We're going to do a trade deal, it's going to be great, and it's not. All the evidence so far has shown that is not what's going to happen. The Irish border situation, for example, that is still not resolved. And this will come back again in 2018, because make no mistake, that issue has not been resolved. And Ireland will veto any deal that does not keep the situation, the border situation between Ireland and the Republic of Ireland the same. So make no mistake on that. So extraordinarily, the future of our country is being decided by men who actually believe this tripe. They are living out a war story for boys, or perhaps Doctor Who on the Daleks, in which the English amateur with a galactic private income somehow defeats order-barking pepper pots bent on radically pure and based on racial purity and domination. It would be funny, except it's not. And this is the tragedy of Brexit. All this hilarious stuff is happening, and it's just I'm like, oh God, why is this happening? Because when national myths hit reality, they lead to national debates which hurt real people. So when and why did we hit upon the idea that the Germans were bad, rational polar opposites to our good, irrational selves? It might seem obvious that that myth arose during 2 world wars. In fact, it predates both, and it is a statutory tale from our national decline. Through our golden era, from about 1740 to around 1860, we were mightily proud but never imagined ourselves born with unique powers. How could we, when we were so clearly meant a curious and deeply multicultural entity? The state, which expected every man to do his duty, was less than 50% English, and about 40% of us were deeply uncomfortable speaking English. We could do it all, including King George II, who personally led his Anglo-German army to victory against the French in 1743. The key to our sunrise was the Royal Navy, the greatest and best funded scientific, technical and industrial phenomenon of the age. A unique motor of imperial triumph and social mobility, John Perkins, a mixed-race sailor from Jamaica with no helpful patrons whatsoever, rose through its ranks to become captain by the 1800s, an equivalent to a full colonel in the army. At the height of our powers, we saw ourselves as the land of industry, trade and merit. Our poor cousins, as we called them in Germany, were hopeless, dreamers, poets and philosophers. We were sure that one day they would unite and adopt our own ways, becoming, as Victoria herself said, a most useful ally for Britain. Then came the Prussian conquest. Oh dear. In 1866, Prussia defeated Austria, and then all the other kingdoms of Germany. The dust had hardly settled when Bismarck finished the job in 1870 to 71. Britons were stunned. The Time compared the Prussians to Attila's Huns, while the graphic sounded like a pre-echo of the World Wars. Writing of the terrible organisation of the German armies and the all-pervaded intelligence, this new Prussianised Germany seemed somehow almost inhuman, somehow almost combining unheard-of military science with sheer brutality. The runaway bestsellers of 1871 was the Battle of Dorking, in which the Prussians followed with a successful invasion of England. It caused such a stir that Gladstone himself felt obliged to remind Britons publicly that it was a mere work of fiction. And the familiar 20th century image was born in 1871. There was nothing irrational in our ancestors' fear. The question was how to deal with this strange new beast. Disraeli's answer was an active British policy in Europe. In 1875, he almost overnight created a league with France and Britain's default enemy at the time, Russia, to deter a second strike on France. Bismarck backed down, furious, and filled with respect for Disraeli. With Britain active and ready to fight, Prussia knew it could not aspire to hegemony. But in 1880, Gladstone began his ascendancy. He offered Britain's new consumer electorate a Pragnition Vista, in which moral force, costing the taxpayer nothing, would maintain the empire without the troublesome alliances and bloated armaments, and as a result Britain retreated from Europe. By 1887, the outliers of the next major war were clear for all to see. It would be France and Russia versus Germany and Austria. Had we at any time between 1887 and 1914 made it clear whose side we were on, and that we would really, as we ended up having to do, fight tooth and claw the Great War, may never well have come about. Instead, we sat on our hands in splendid isolation, but our great-great-grandfathers knew in their bones that it was all futile. The secret mood was perfectly summed up in three of the biggest publishing hits of 1896 and 1897. E. Williams, Made in Germany, a insidious and deadly battling with the might and main for the exaltation of our supremacy. Kipling's Resitional, all our pomp was yesterday, is one with Naveen and Tyre, and Wells' War of the Worlds, intellects vast and cool, unsympathetic, slowly and surely drawing their dread plans against us. It was now late Victorian and Edwardian Britain that the mindset of the likes of Liam Fox and Daniel Hannan were invented, not out of strength, but as a sheer desperate vision of reality. The mass scribes of a fat and fading consumer neglect, a fat consumer nation, declining that things like method, planning, funding, education and merit, dedication and professionalism were the very things that had created the empire, were now for the Germans. We didn't need them. What we didn't need was alliances because, well, we had a special racial power. The buzzword of the age was pluck. And since we were alone and born with British pluck, if we had just played up and played the game, we'd have somehow bested a rival which everyone knew was better educated, outproducing and technologically outstripping the empire. But there was always something almost crack-brain suicide about the notion. By the 1900s, the Royal Navy, in which an obviously half-black captain would now have been quite unthinkable, was clad in Krupp's armour plate, because it was so undeniably better than our own. But never mind pluck, we would win the day. When it didn't quite work out at the Great Battle of Jutland in 1916, the British press fawned on Admiral Beatty, who had caused most of our casualties by leading his battle cruisers into semi-extermination. Beatty was accordingly made Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet for his pluck and audacity. It was his adoring hacks put it, at the Somme, and 25 years later in the Western Desert, before the arrival of Montgomery, thousands of young Britons died because of senior commanders genuinely believed that in the chaos of a free-running battlefield, plucky young Britons, public schoolmen, would naturally be better leaders than the production line junior officers that were turned out by the German infrastructure. The truth was the exact opposite. The army could indeed beat the Germans, but only when the numbers were right and when the generals copied the alleged German virtues of careful staff work and meticulous planning, as it were to follow. Prussia, though, is now gone. We've ended up having to spill vast amounts of blood to help abolish it. For God's sake, we should know. But the wretched mindset lives on. we continue to evade the truth that some laws of nature and economics apply to us and every other country. At the end of the last millennium, we discovered the idea of buccaneering capitalism. Anglo-Americans couldn't compete in manufacturing anymore, but it didn't matter, because we, this briefly and mentionable included Icelanders, were somehow uniquely equipped for acts of bold and financial semi-piracy. The boring, non-buccaneering side of capitalism was for the methodical and plodding Germans. The Economist of June 1919 even gloated that Germany was the sick man of Europe. Our Brexit negotiators are horrible men who believe this nonsense and still do today. They truly believe that even if the people of the likes of Bank of America and Merrill Lynch that the EU holds all the cards, then we don't need to negotiate rationally. They can outplay the Germans, who of course secretly run the EU, which of course is the huge byword constantly, just by plucky British baffling. In the real world, when the Gatling was jammed and the Colonel dead, British pluck usually just ended up as sad names on memorial, an Edwardian myth born out of national decline. It's leading us once again over the top to certain disaster. So, I can absolutely agree with it. That is the mindset that a lot of these people and Brexiteers have. They are imagining it as almost it's another secret battle against Germany, who of course secretly run the EU, which is laughable. But that's the situation we are in. And how are negotiations going to go with people who are arguing with that mindset? Not very well at all.